The court fool known as Patchface is a fan favorite tertiary character in A Song of Ice and Fire. Many years ago, Lord Stephen Baratheon traveled across the Narrow Sea to Volantis in order to find a Valyrian bride for Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. He was unsuccessful in that pursuit, but he did encounter an interesting young slave boy. Slaves on the Long Bridge are typically tattooed with markings dictating their profession, hence why Patchface's face has, well, patches. Fools are marked with a motley pattern often associated with court jesters. Lord Baratheon wrote several letters home to his young sons, describing their newly acquired fool as incredibly clever and quick, the smartest boy he had ever known. Robert and Stannis Baratheon eagerly awaited their father's return, only to see his vessel razed by one of the vicious storms of Shipbreaker Bay. There appeared to be no survivors from this colossal wreck. That is, until Patchface washed ashore. At first, the fool seemed cold and dead, unresponsive, but suddenly, while being examined, Patchface burst up and began breathing once again. Though he survived, the boy was forever scarred by the experience. While once he was witty and even intelligent, only a shell of that person remained. These days, he serves the court of the one true king, providing jests that seem infused with some sort of supernatural influence. Today, we'll be discussing the fools of A Song of Ice and Fire, and how they tie into both foreshadowing and prophecy throughout the series. Before getting into specific fools from Gurm's story, it's important to take a look at the archetype of a fool and what that entails in literature as a whole. That's right, I've Trojan horsed some literary analysis into your theory video. I've got you now. Sixth grade class that doesn't know this channel exists would be quite proud of this, as they did just finish their unit on Greece and they really liked the big horse. Anyway, there are two main archetypes of fools in literature. The first is simply called the fool, and it's pretty much considered the butt of the joke in most scenarios. Oftentimes, they aren't the brightest, and they're usually just around for comic relief. The other archetype is often called the jester or the Shakespearean fool. These individuals tend to be focused on truth telling, and they often dispense wisdom. In Shakespeare's plays specifically, the fools are often smarter than the nobles for which they perform. Turning back to George R. R. Martin and his series, he tends to combine elements of both of these archetypes in an interesting way. Most of his fools do fall squarely into the first category, generally being the butt of the joke and little more than that to those around them. However, they do have shades of jester throughout. They're often tied to some form of greater knowledge through magical means or through spying, and they act as a way to foreshadow things in a meta sense. Today we'll be discussing 5 of those fools and their larger role in the narrative of A Song of Ice and Fire, ending with theories into the prophecies of Patchface, which I am partial to in all regards, as Patchface is the best. To begin, one of the more well-known fools in A Song of Ice and Fire is Aegon Frey, a jester of the crossing known as Jinglebell. He's given that nickname on account of the bells he wears in his hair and on his hat. He appears only in the third book, A Storm of Swords, though he's mentioned earlier than that, and he's present at the crossing both before and during the Red Wedding. His presence is one of the first alarm bells, pun intended, that something is wrong at the event. Catelyn thinks it's an insult for him to be present at their meeting with Walder, and specifically wonders if he always wears a fool's crown. This seems to be a slight against Robb, if not, as Walder's calling him a fool of a king. Aegon remains present for the wedding feast and ultimately gets caught in the crossfire. He is seized by Catelyn in an attempt to bargain for her son's life, but ultimately Walder states that Aegon wasn't that useful to begin with. Catelyn kills the fool and soon dies herself. Aegon's death is tragic, as it's a final, futile act of violence that has no true purpose other than giving Cat a moment of vengeance as she departs the mortal coil. One of the most tragic passages surrounding the Red Wedding comes from the ghost of Highheart foreseeing the event, telling Arya that, quote, I dreamt of a wolf howling in the rain, but no one heard his grief, the dwarf woman was saying. I dreamt such a clangor that my head might burst, drums and horns and pipes and screams, but the saddest song was the little bells. This ties into the kind of music being the giveaway as to why the Red Wedding is happening and what is happening to Cat initially. And just the little bells, for some reason, just make me sad because this poor fool was killed for seemingly no reason. There's also one quite unusual theory that lists Jinglebell as a dark horse, and not in the Tyrek sense, to fulfill a prophecy from the very start of the series. Daenerys hears the Dothraki prophecy of the stallion that mounts the world, who is supposed to be this great uniting force for their people. That said, many of those criteria listed for that prophecy fit Aegon Frey incredibly well. It said that the bell in the stallion's hair will signal its coming, which matches Jinglebell better than any other character in the series. What's more, it says that the wives of his enemies will, quote, weep tears of blood and rend their flesh in grief, which is exactly what Catelyn Stark does just after killing Aegon. She tears at her face, leaving these bloody tears in their wake. There are also portions discussing trembling enemies and tents, which bring to mind the Red Wedding and its surrounding massacre. When I first heard this theory, I dismissed it as being completely absurd, but these days I think this prophecy might be meant to be interpreted in different ways. And one of those ways could be as a warning for the Red Wedding, as many prophecies were prior to the third book in the series. Shifting focus from the Riverlands to King's Landing, we have a pair of fools in the Court of the Crown, the first of which is known simply as the Moon Boy. If you're basing your view of Westeros purely on Jaime's chapters from Feast, you might think that the Moon Boy is one of the most important characters in Westeros. You would be correct, but that said, there's a lot more to the Moon Boy than meets the eye. He's thought to be quite slow, however, this might not be the case. Sir Dontos Hollard, who we'll get to in a minute, voices suspicion that the Moon Boy could be working for Varys. This would make sense, as in the first book, Sansa speculates that he might be more intelligent than those around him perceive him as. This would also make sense for Varys as a character. He was raised by mummers, and given this connection, he would know just how valuable a fool can be. People in this position are privy to all sorts of political goings on, especially when the royalty believe them to not understand what's being said. The other fool in the royal court has already been mentioned, Sir Dontos Hollard. Dontos' role in the story has already come to its conclusion, and it can be viewed as a reinforcement of the typical wise fool archetype. He's the one who gives Sansa the necklace that is allegedly used to poison Joffrey. When he does so, he directly states that this necklace relates to seeking closure for her father and freedom from herself. Sir Dontos is constantly underestimated, and that's what allows him to get away with providing the murder weapon that is allegedly used against King Joffrey, perfectly mirroring the wise fool archetype. The only person who doesn't underestimate this particular fool is Peter Baelish, who kills Dontos after retrieving Sansa. The difference in the treatment of fools seems to mirror the styles of espionage favored by the Spider and the Mockingbird. Varys takes many into his employ, building his web of information, while Peter relies only on his own intricate plots and trusts no one else. Varys has some larger scheme, potentially with other players involved, while Peter is entirely and singularly self-interested. One final note on Fools and King's Landing. The Tyrells brought their fool, Butterbumps, to the capital for the last 3 books in the series. He hasn't done much so far other than sing The Bear and the Maiden Fair at a very loud volume in order to provide cover for a secret conversation, but even that is potential foreshadowing. The song had only ever been vaguely referenced once before, and by hearing the actual lyrics, it set up fairly well as context and or a parallel to the Jaime and Brienne story from later on in A Storm of Swords. This brings us to the most important fool in our story, Patchface. As mentioned earlier, he currently serves as a court fool for King Stannis Baratheon. He also acts as a constant companion for the king's daughter, Princess Shireen Baratheon, and she thinks that his songs and dances are tremendously entertaining. We get to see this particular fool through 3 points of view throughout the entire series so far. He's introduced in Crescent's prologue, he's in Davos' perspective throughout Clash and Storm, and interacts with Jon Snow a fair bit during A Dance with Dragons. Patchface serves as a sort of a canary in the coal mine during the first chapter of A Clash of Kings. This prologue serves as an introduction to the entirety of the Stannis camp, Patchface included. He's highlighted as an important part of it, even if he's disregarded by the characters therein. He warns Crescent, the point of view character, with an ominous song, stating that, quote, "The shadows come to dance, my lord, dance, my lord, dance, my lord. The shadows come to stay, my lord, stay, my lord, stay, my lord." I apologize for not singing, but I really don't want to subject you guys to that. So, frankly, you're welcome. This is a clear reference to Melisandre and her magic, as her defining magical act of the second book, which hasn't happened yet as of this prologue chapter, is giving birth to a shadow baby that's used to kill Renly Baratheon. Patchface is stating this not only to highlight the force of magic that is now attached to Stannis' cause, but that magical force will remain no matter what Crescent does. The fool also seems to be attempting to prevent Crescent's death, or even celebrating his knowledge of it. The latter seems even more likely, given that Melisandre is the only individual who seems to acknowledge Patch's intelligence, as she calls him clever, while calling Crescent foolish. This vision seems to indicate that Patchface has some form of supernatural intelligence, and given that fact, it's important to assess where that knowledge may originate. The most likely candidate is some form of divine entity, perhaps either the drowned god or the Lord of Light. We know that divinity in this world has the power to restore people from the dead, as has happened with Beric and Lady Stoneheart. Patchface being revived from a shipwreck after days of death seems to indicate that he could be To the drowned god what Beric is to the Lord of Light. This ties into one of the main settings for Patchface's prophecies, the sea. The sea seems to serve as a stand-in for two places, one physical and one metaphorical. The ancient civilization of Valyria and the ruins thereof, and death itself. Valyria is clearly paralleled in several visions. Patchface states that under the sea, birds have scales instead of feathers, which brings to mind dragons, being scaled creatures with wings. We also hear that no one under the sea wears hats, which could correspond to the fact that Valyria does not use the system of lordship and nobility that are used in Westeros. And lastly, Patchface references it snowing up under the sea and describes smoke rising in bubbles, gray and blue and black. These final visions bring to mind the ruins of Valyria, including ashes rising into the sky from whatever doomed the city, and the sunken portions of the city emitting smoking volcanic bubbles from the ruins. In A Dance with Dragons, he also makes several interesting predictions in Jon's chapter that have to do with death, the sea, and the Night's Watch. Specifically, when the group is talking about a Hardhome, which hasn't happened yet in the books, Patchface says that in the dark the dead are dancing. This seems to show that he knows something about the White Walkers and about the others, that something at Hardhome is not right, and the dead are living there. What's more, he states that under the sea the crows are white as snow, which I think is quite interesting. I think that this might parallel Jon's death. As Jon dies in his final chapter of A Dance with Dragons, and the sea, as we've talked about previously, represents some form of death in Patchface's visions. Perhaps it's saying that once Jon is going to die, he's going to return perhaps paler than he had thought previously, and his hair might be white, which is something else that people have theorized after Jon's death. This could reflect his Targaryen heritage, and could tie into the sea being both Valyria and death, showing it's both things for Jon Snow as well. There are also quite a few dark omens surrounding Patchface himself. Melisandre says that she's glimpsed him in her fires, with blood on his lips and skulls about him, which seems as though he could cause some form of death in the camps or in the north. Additionally, he speaks of leading Shireen into the sea and back out again, which seems to be seemingly leading Shireen into death and perhaps back out again as a White Walker, as some form of undead entity, as he might be. So both of these things seem quite kind of suspect given his relationship with Shireen and the prophetic nature of his own visions and Melisandre's visions at the Wall, which are stronger than ever in both cases. So, what do you think of Patchface? Do you have any theories about his visions, what might come of him in the future, and overall, what do you think of the other fools in the story as well? Is there anything I missed? Which of these fools is your favorite? I'd love to hear answers to all of these questions and more in the comments below. So be sure to leave a like and subscribe while you're down there as well. I'd love to hear back from everybody, as it does help me make sure that people are, enjoying what I'm putting out. So yeah, if you enjoy this, do all those things. I'd really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm actually graduating from college in a week or so. So after that, I should have more time to work on videos. So expect big things in the summer. I've got one more video at least coming that's going to be talking about a historical fool in A Song of Ice and Fire, as it's mushroom time soon. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I hope you all tune into more soon. I will see you then.